much indeed, and I'm going to thank you very much indeed, and I'm going to share my screen now, and I would like you just to tell me that you can see it properly before I start.
Yes, we can see it, Chris.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great honor to be able to speak to you and your guests, your brokers, and your insurance people all around the country, and I see also all around the world. It really is great to speak to you today. We have stage 4 load shedding at the moment. We have, of course, had up to stage 6 load shedding in the past. And I want to talk to you firstly about load shedding, both looking back to see where we're coming from, where we are right now, and then the outlook going forward. And of course, what is on many people's minds is the probability or likelihood or not of a national blackout. What is a national blackout? What are the consequences? And what Eskom does to prevent a national blackout? And if it does happen, in the unlikely event that it happens, how do they restart? And what are the consequences, especially for people who are in the risk business, the insurance business? And we'll talk about these various things. So just to start off with, I think it is important to understand where we are and where we're coming from, not to be pessimistic and over gloomy, but if you want to know where you've got to go, you've got to know where you're coming from, and you've got to know where you are right now. So this graph, the data comes from the well-known website Eskom's Push, and they monitor, how much load shedding is going on, and they tell us when we're going to go on and off. And you can see here that since 2008, the level of load shedding has been increasing very significantly. And you can see, from 2018 to 2022. So this is looking backwards for the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And you can see each bar of the bar graph indicates the level of load shedding in the number of hours of load shedding. And if you divide the hours by 24, you get to the number of days of load shedding. So it's the total number of hours divided by 24 gives you the amount of days of load shedding. It's color coded, as you can see, from yellow up to red and sort of pink. But the bottom line is that if you look at 2022, you'll see a lot more red. That is stage 4 load shedding, the red color. And if you compare it to the amount of stage 4 load shedding we had in 2021, you can see the really dramatic increase in stage 4 load shedding. And you can also see the stage 5 and stage 6 load shedding in 22 right at the top of the bar. Now, look, you know this graph because you feel it every day. You know that things have been getting worse, but this just tries to tell you how things are going. And it's not a pretty picture. I want to just move to my next slide here, which is a very similar graph. It shows also from 2018, a very significant increase, but this time it's not showing the number of hours of load shedding. It's shown the amount of energy measured in gigawatt hours that is lost to the productive economy as a result of load shedding. But it follows a similar pattern, sharply increasing from 2018 up to 2022. And but you can see that the actual 2022 bar graph is about 5 times or 4 to 5 times higher than 2021. And it's even more dramatic than the hours of load shedding. And that's because of the significantly increased number of hours of stage 4, 5, and 6 load shedding. Because obviously, stage 4 and 5 and 6 load shedding, you lose a lot more energy to the economy than stage 1, 2, and 3. Stage 4 is 4,000 megawatts, and if you have that for an hour, that's 4,000 megawatt hours lost. And stage 6, it would be 6,000 megawatt hours for an hour would be lost to the economy. So because of the higher levels of stage 4, 5, and 6 load shedding, that 2022 bar graph is dramatically higher than 21, which is the impact, you can say. It is a kind of a measure of the impact on the productive economy. And again, there's not any real surprises in these figures, but it just presents to you the data. This particular graph is prepared annually by the CSIR, so the numbers are really solid and accurate and reliable. But let's move now to the next slide, which looks at the Eskom fleet of generators. It looks at their availability. Now, the availability of the fleet is measured in technical terms by a measurement known as the energy availability factor. But in simple terms, it indicates how much of the Eskom fleet is available for service at any time, and it's usually measured over a period of time, because if you were to measure the availability at a particular instant in time, it is very, very volatile, because generators are switching on and off all the time, breaking down, being recovered, and just normally switching on and off to meet demand as the demand grows during the day and declines during the night. So normally you measure the energy availability factor over a period of either a week or a month or 3 months or 6 months. In Eskom's financials, they report the energy availability factor over a period of a year. So they look at the whole year. Now, the graphs you see here, which are the energy availability factor measured weekly, over a weekly period. So you'll see on the horizontal axis, there are 52 weeks of the year. And on the vertical axis is a percentage. So it's expressed as the percentage of the Eskom fleet that is available for service. And you can see the different graphs for the different years. The top graph, the blue graph, is 2021. The orange graph is 2022. And the gray graph is 2023 to date, up to week number 27. Which is the last week. So every week Eskom published this. Now this data comes from Eskom itself. It's published on the Eskom website, but I take this data and I turn it into a graph, because if you were just to look at a long list of numbers, very hard to see what is really going on. So these graphs try to present it in a way that is understandable. So the data comes from Eskom, the graphs are prepared by myself, and I update these graphs once a week. Now, the important thing to note about this is that, first of all, the energy availability factor is quite volatile. It's up and down. But over a 1 year period, it follows a kind of a parabolic trend. It starts off lower in the beginning of the year at week number 1, which is in the middle of summer. And it's relatively much lower in summer, and it rises, the availability of the fleet rises in winter, which is the middle of the year, and then drops down again in summer towards the end of the year. So this parabolic curve is typical of each year, and you'll see I've put in the trend graph in dotted for each of those. And the important thing to note is that the trend over a period of year is getting lower. The availability is not improving year by year, is declining. Even this year, we can see that although you'll notice quite a good improvement from week number 15 up till week number 27, we are still below the trend of last year, significantly below the trend. And we can expect that this energy availability factor will follow the same parabolic trend and will start to decline towards the end of this year. So whilst everybody is going rah, 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 things are improving, the energy availability factor is improving, that is absolutely normal. That is typical. That's what always happens in winter, and it always declines again to summer. Now, there's good reason for this, because Eskom do a lot of their maintenance in summer because demand for electricity is lower in summer. So because a lot of units are down for planned maintenance, the energy availability factor is lower because less plant is available, because a lot of plant is being shut down for planned maintenance. And they do this maintenance in summer so that the plant is going to be ready to perform better and in winter. And in winter, they do less maintenance. So more of the Eskom fleet is available for service. And that's why the energy availability factor increases towards winter. And then as summer months come along, because the demand for electricity is declining, they start ramping up their planned maintenance and the availability factor declines. So nothing unexpected. It is quite volatile, as you can see. But when you measure the energy availability factor, as you know, even at 1 week, you tend to see this volatility. If you measure the energy availability factor over a month or 3 months, it kind of has an averaging effect, and you don't see this volatility. But there you have it for the last 3 years up to today, right up to today. It's also interesting to look at this trend. You know, what has been happening to the energy availability factor for the last, let's just say, in this particular case, for the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And you can see each year, 2016 to 2007, you can see that parabolic trend for the year. Then if you look from 2017 to 18, a similar parabolic trend. 18 to 19, every year you see this parabolic trend, rising in the middle of the year and dropping at the end of the year. And you can see the trend line over the last 7 years is consistently downwards. Now, that tells you that things have been getting worse in terms of the Eskom plant performance year by year, and we know this. It's due to the plant is getting older every year. It's been pushed very hard. It hasn't been well maintained over the years, so its performance and its availability is declining. Now, where we are today is that a lot of attention is being given, and we've been now looking backwards. And the question is really, what's going to happen going forward? What can we expect, you know, for the rest of this year? What can we expect next year and the next year, etc.? Can we change the direction of this trend by new efforts, new management, new focus on accountability, a new Minister of Electricity? You know, is it going to change this trend? And I think the point I want to make is that the energy availability factor is the average of about 80 generators in the Eskom fleet. Now, it's impossible to work on these 80 generators simultaneously. In other words, you can't shut them down and fix them all at once, because if you did so, you would have to shut down the whole country. So you have to maintain and fix these generators step by step in sequence. And it takes about 3 to 4 months of extended shutdown to do deep level maintenance on a generator. And so they can't work on them all at the same time. They work on maybe a group of 3 or 4 or 5 at the same time, and they work on this in sequence. And what this means is that you cannot have a sudden change in the availability factor, because you can't work on them all simultaneously, and there's 80 of them. So what is the best that one can expect? Well, in mathematical terms, what you're seeing in a trend of availability of 80 generators is what is known as a continuum. It means because of this averaging and because you can't work on them all at the same time, the graph is what is known as a continuum. In other words, you cannot have a sudden change, a step change upwards in the availability factor. This trend line, that dotted line you see there, cannot suddenly do a step change upwards. Not only that, it cannot even, as it's declining, it cannot change its direction suddenly and start moving upwards. A continuum means that it's a continuous curve. What that means is, as it declines, what you can do is you can slow down the rate of decline, you can bottom out, and then you can slowly start increasing. So you cannot change the direction suddenly, and you cannot do a step change, but you can do a smooth change. And what that means is that it takes time to change its direction, bottom out, and then start increasing again. So you should not expect sudden changes in that dotted line. But one can, by working on the problem, effectively and steadily, one can change the direction slowly in a continuous fashion. Okay, so that's a main message that I want, that one should be careful about politicians who promise you that it's suddenly going to change direction or do a step change, etc. It just doesn't work like that when you're doing an average of 80 generators that you can't fix all at once. So I'm moving on to the next slide now. Now, we know that's where we are. We're in a crisis. And it was acknowledged, in July last year, 2019, when the president put a plan on the table after extensive consultation. In fact, many people will criticize that it took too much consultation, but that's the way our president operates. He consults very, very, very widely. Some would say too widely, but okay, whatever. He put a plan on the table, and it's 5 points to this plan, 5 main points to the plan. And there's a lot of detail behind each of these 5 points. And there's these 5 points, this picture you see here is cut and paste from the plan that was published by the president. And this is the summary. And, one can criticize a plan, and I have criticized certain aspects of the plan. And you speak to 10 different people, you'll get 10 different opinions about the plan. What is important, I think, is to have a plan. You'll never get everybody agreeing with everything on the plan. But at least you've got a plan on the table. And the other thing that's important about a plan on the table is you've got to stick to it. You should not, once you put the plan on the table, because you get a bit of criticism from somebody or other, you start chopping and changing the plan, reworking it, etc. Then things never get done. And it is a problem in South Africa. President puts a plan on the table. People start criticizing it because that's just their nature. And then they start chopping and changing the plan. And I call this the white ant effect. You put a plan on the table, and then a whole lot of white ants come gnawing away and undermining this plan. And then nothing happens. So if you want to have, you should consult, you should put a plan on the table, you should stick to it, even though there may be some weaknesses in the plan. No plan is going to be perfect and please everybody. But that is the plan. Now, I have criticized certain aspects of this plan, and I'll say them again. First of all, I think in some ways the plan is a little too complex, and it's covering both short-term options, medium-term options, and long-term options. And you can see it, and I'll discuss this. It would have been better, in my personal opinion, not that that means anything, but it'd be better to actually focus on some quick wins and work hard on the quick wins to achieve some quick results. 80% of the problem can be solved by 20% of the issues that need to be done. So I would try and identify some of the high impact interventions that can produce quick wins to reduce load shedding quickly and win the confidence of the public. And then, of course, one needs to work on the medium term and the longer term issues. It's not to say that those are not important. They are important, and you do have to start those things now. Because if you only look at the short term issues and you don't focus on the medium and the longer term issues, you won't be ready with the medium and longer term issues, because you won't have started them. You need to start them now in order to be ready in the medium and the longer term. But I do think that's too much of the effort has been focused on the longer term issues, which are not going to bring quick wins to the problem at hand. And I just give you an example. So if you look at this plan, it says here, fix Eskom and improve the availability of the Eskom supply. Now, I've just spoken to you about this, that this cannot happen quickly. It takes time to improve the availability of the existing supply. because of this continuum and the fact that you can't work on it, but you still have to do it. You have to work on the problem, but you're not going to fix Eskom and improve its availability overnight. Okay. Look at point number 5, fundamentally transform the electricity supply sector to achieve long-term energy security. Yes, that's important. Yes, Eskom is busy being restructured, but we're not going to see the effects of this for the next 3, 4, 5 years, even longer. So that's not a short-term thing. What is, I think, worth looking at in this here is that there are some activities that I consider to be quick wins. So, for example, accelerate private sector investments in generation capacity. This is in the mines and industry. Now, this also, unfortunately, is not that quick. It takes time to build a 100 megawatt, 200 megawatt solar plant or wind plant. It takes 3 years plus. So that's not really that quick, but it's an important one. Accelerate procurement of new capacity from renewables, gas, and battery storage. That's really important. And number 4, unleash the business and households to invest in rooftop. That is a quick win. That can deliver in 6 months very significant new generation capacity, which is a way of self-generation. But by doing that, you relieve the burden on Eskom. In other words, you relieve, instead of demanding a certain amount from Eskom, you're going to generate a certain amount yourself, and that means Eskom has to produce less, and that will help with load shedding. So, okay, those are some, I hope, gentle criticism of the plan, but overall, I think this plan is a good plan. It's as good a plan as anybody else is going to put on the table. It's already on the table. It's taken too long to get to grips with. It was put on the table in July last year. It's a year later. Yes, I do think we're starting to see the impacts of this plan, but it's taken a year to get going. That's too long when you've got a crisis of stage 6 load shedding. Okay, that's just gentle criticisms. As I mentioned, there's a lot of detail behind this, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but I've put it on the slide here of the kind of underlying detail that's got to be done to implement those 5 points. Now, I'm not going to go through this, but the slide deck is available to those who are attending today, and so you'll be able to see that in the slide deck if you're interested in looking at the more detail. So now, look, we've looked backwards for the last 5-7 years. We've looked at where we are today, and let me just repeat where we are today. We're at stage 4 load shedding at the moment. It's in the middle of winter. People were talking about stage 8 load shedding this winter, but I think that was, really somewhat alarmist by some commentators and analysts without a real deep understanding of what happens in winter. The reality is this winter, you've got to understand, what is load shedding? Load shedding occurs to bring supply and demand into balance. And if demand is higher than supply, and you do nothing about it, you will eventually have a national blackout, and we're going to talk about that. So load shedding is caused by the imbalance between supply and demand. And to prevent a national blackout, you need to do 2 things. You either need to increase supply to reduce the gap, or you've got to reduce demand. Now, you can't, once you've got everything running that you've got available, you can't increase it anymore. So the only option now is to reduce demand to bring supply and demand in balance. And that gap represents the amount that Eskom does to bring supply and demand in balance, that is to reduce demand, and they do that through load shedding. So we're experiencing load shedding, but in winter, because the demand for electricity goes up, one would think intuitively that you're going to have more load shedding in winter. But no, if you look historically, our worst load shedding has been in summer. Just think back to the stage 6 load shedding in December 2019. That first time we had stage 6 ever in South Africa was in the middle of summer, not in the middle of winter. And why is this? So let's try and understand. Whilst demand is higher in winter, we know that there's more demand for electricity in winter because it's colder. but there's more supply in winter. We've looked at that energy availability curve. The availability of the Eskom plant improves in winter. So there's more supply in winter. And there's also been a lot of wind in the Cape, the east and west coast in the Cape this winter, and that's caused good wind resources. The wind generation has been good. There's also been good solar performance, particularly driven by the fact that a lot of commercial and residential solar PV and battery and storage has been installed in the last year or two, a lot, and it's making an impact. It's reducing the amount, it's increasing the supply of electricity in South Africa, reducing the amount of load that has to be shed by Eskom to balance supply and demand. So wind and solar are making themselves felt. On the demand side, demand has been lower this year than last year. And the reason for that is that the price of electricity is going up so significantly that people are being far more conscious about their usage of electricity. And another point to make is that in the 3 winter months of the year, the Megaflex tariff, the Eskom Megaflex tariff, which applies to all large industries, smelters, aluminium smelters, mines, etc., the price of electricity goes up by 3 times and more even. And this means that certain industries that are using a lot of electricity, they simply cannot afford to operate in winter. They shut down and they do their maintenance over winter because the price of electricity is such that it would be uneconomical to operate in winter. So whilst the demand for electricity does go up, domestic demand goes up, industrial demand for electricity goes down. And that offsets some of the increase in electricity consumption or the demand for electricity that you would otherwise expect. Because the prices have gone up, and on top of this, you have this winter tariff. That is why demand for electricity has dropped this year. And to the extent where actually we have not had the stage 8 load shedding because supply has increased and demand has decreased. So we haven't had to do as much load shedding as we had thought, or that some people had thought. Okay, so we know where we came from. We know where we are. We've talked about we can talk a little bit in due course about the future. Well, let's do it now. What do we expect for the end of for this year? Well, I expect that at the end of August, remember June, July, and August are the winter months. I expect that load shedding will start to increase again more significantly in August. But towards the end of this year, in November and December, some new generation capacity is coming on from Eskom. That is the Kusile power station generators that failed, ducting failure, are going to be returned to service. And one of the generators that was under commissioning is going to be returned to service. So we're going to have a significant increase in new generation capacity coming on stream towards the end of this year. So I think if all goes well, if things go to plan, as Eskom say, of course, sometimes things don't go to plan, but if things go to plan, we can expect that I think things will get worse, after August, and then start to improve in November, December, and January next year. And then in the middle of next year, 2 units are coming back on, one at Kusile and 1 unit at Medupi in July. That's the plan. Must stress it's the plan. But if those 2 units come on again, that will help us in the winter months next year. So I do see that going forward, with the additional focus by the Minister of Electricity and these new units coming on, and a great awareness that things will slowly start to improve towards the end of this year and next year. And then let's see what happens going forward. I think there is a lot of effort being put in, and things should start improving in the future. Okay, having said that, we're now moving on to the second half of this presentation. That is to talk about national blackout and what is the probability and the consequences, etc. Now, the first thing I want to say is that in looking at this, I have consulted quite widely with people who know a lot about this subject. And you can see there the 3 people I've consulted. Robbie van Heerden, he used to work he was the head of the system operator at Eskom, and they are the people that decide on what generators they're going to switch on and switch off, etc. And they look at the whole national situation. He's now retired, but he's a consultant in the private sector. But he's got many, many years of experience in this field. Gavin Herford. He currently works at the system operator right now at present, and he's been in charge of the system operation on an acting basis for a while. Very technical person and highly regarded, and I've consulted him. And lastly, a guy called Robert Koch. He was a guy who was at Eskom in charge of risk management. He put in place the load shedding schedules, the whole load shedding protocols, all the tools that Eskom have at their disposal to prevent load shedding and to manage supply and demand. And he also put in place all the protocols on how to prevent a national blackout, as well as how to recover from a national blackout. So again, an important person in the risk field. He actually now has left Eskom. He's working in Yalland, a company called Grid, which is the national grid company of Yalland, and he's helping them put in place their load shedding plans, their protocols for black start recovery. You know, South Africa is regarded very highly in this field because we've done it before. We've got load shedding schedules in place. We are well practiced in these load shedding. We practice it every single day of the week, and that gives us some significant skills in managing this process. And other countries are starting to consult South Africa as experts in load shedding because we've got so much experience on it. Look, it's not something you want to be too proud of, to be an expert in load shedding, but nevertheless, other countries are recognizing that they can learn things from South Africa. Now, at this point, I want to do a little poll just for some fun, and I want to ask you, you know, what do you think? A lot of people, fear, and I think even the insurance industry are worried about a national blackout. That's why some of the insurance companies are excluding that from their policies. I would like to do a poll and ask you, the audience, what do you think right now? Do you think, as we are in stage 4, 5, 6 load shedding, is the risk of a national blackout higher than it was previously? Is it lower than it was previously? Or is it the same as it was? Remember, load shedding, we first had load shedding in 2007, 2008. So I want to ask you, and I want you to poll and tell me, you see the question on the screen there, is the probability of a national blackout now, with the high levels of load shedding that we're experiencing these days, is the probability of a national blackout higher now, or is it the same as it was in 2008, or is it a lower probability? I'm interested in your vote. And I think you can see on the screen, I'm seeing it on my screen, that most people, 62% of the votes so far, are saying that the probability now at stage 4, 5, and 6 load shedding is higher than it was in 2008. A number of you, 21%, are saying that it's about the same as it was then, no increase in the risk. And a lesser amount, 17%, are saying that the risk is lower. Look, we'll leave this poll on just for another, let's say, 30 seconds. But I think you can see it's starting to stabilize. The figures are stable. We've had about 413 votes, I see, somewhere. Sorry, 256 votes there, 258 votes plus 91 votes plus 72 votes, total of 422. Okay, it seems to have pretty much stabilized now. So I think I'm going to, or can I ask the I2 people to end this poll? And you can just note that 60% of people feel that the situation is worse. And others, think it's about the same. 22% feel the same, and 17% think that it's lower. Now, that's really interesting. And I want to give you my analysis and my view of the situation. And I would like to say, take the minority view that the risk of load shedding now is lower than it was in 2008. Now, it's counterintuitive, but I want to explain why I say that. Do you remember in 2007, when we first had load shedding? Oh, it was a big surprise. And it caused great confusion. Why? Because we were completely unprepared for it. We didn't even have load shedding schedules. The municipalities were running around like chickens without heads. Eskom didn't have load shedding schedules at that time. Robert Koch only designed these load shedding schedules after the first set of load shedding. And so South Africa as a country was very unprepared and very unpracticed. We hadn't practiced load. We didn't even have load shedding schedule, let alone having practiced them. We then put them in place. And today we are extremely well practiced in balancing supply and demand. Very well practiced. We practice every single day. Not only that, we've got these detailed protocols that Robert Koch has put in place. And not only has he put these protocols in place, they actually test these protocols and practice them. And they have simulators, like a flight simulator, where they train the operators in national control is how to respond quickly to bring supply and demand into balance. And we're going to talk about all of this a bit further. But I think that was an interesting sort of poll to see what you thought. It's counterintuitive, but I think we are better prepared. Remember, in 2008, the mining industry, the whole of the mining industry had to shut down for 3 or 4 weeks as a result of that load shedding because we were so unprepared. And, you had thousands of people working underground in mines. This is a highly dangerous situation when you have load shedding. And now we have what is known as load curtailment and load shedding. So critical industries like the mining industry are not load shed. They are load curtailed. They have to reduce demand, but they're not cut off like you and me. They just have to reduce the demand because it's not safe to cut off power to a mine. The mines can get flooded, not enough air down there. Lives can be put in danger. And that's why the industry had to shut down because they didn't have load curtailment plans in place. And it was too dangerous to carry on mining. So, okay, that was good. I'm not sure if I can ask the I2 people, you can remove that poll window from the screen so that people can see the presentation. At the moment, I'm looking at the poll results. Can you take down the poll results if that's possible? I hope it's possible.
Chris, it's down on our side. Maybe if you just minimize it on your side.
Oh, jolly good. You're right. Thank you so much for that. Because I couldn't see my presentation, but now I can. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next slide. If I can. I hope it's going to move to the next slide. There we go. Right. So having spoken to Eskom, they explained to me that they take what is known, and I thought this was quite funny, the Swiss cheese risk management approach. And you may ask, what the hell is this? I'll try and explain it. As you know, when you get a piece of Swiss cheese, it's a large chunk of cheese, and you can't see through it. But if you cut it open, you'll see there's lots of holes in it, what you might call weaknesses in the system. But all of these holes are not aligned. They in different positions. So if you were to slice that Swiss cheese into a whole lot of slices, as you can see there on the screen, in order to get to the final disaster, you would need to have a number of these failures line up and simultaneously fail in order for you to see the disaster through all these holes. But because there are so many layers, the probability of these all lining up and all happening, all these weaknesses happening or failures in the system happening at the same time, that risk is extremely low indeed. And the more of these layers that you have of what they call risk management layers, the less the probability of load shedding. And you would have to have all these layers fail in order to reach the end disaster of a national blackout. Okay, so that's the general principle. Looking now at the levers that Eskom has, these are these different layers. These are the levers that Eskom can pull to prevent a national blackout. And you can see there's a lot of levers. And we're experiencing some of them at the moment, but there are still many levers available to Eskom to prevent a national blackout. And I just want to run through them very quickly. The first lever that Eskom has at its disposal is what they call their power alerts. They go on radio or TV and they urge you to please cut back on use of electricity, switch off geysers, switch off heaters, etc., etc. And by doing this, they can immediately reduce demand for electricity by 250 megawatts. However, there are diminishing returns to this approach because you're asking for charity to Eskom. They are pleading with you to reduce demand. In an emergency, you will respond. But if it happens every day for 3 months, you get the hell in. And you don't respond like you used to respond. It's like crying wolf. When you cry too often, people tend to ignore it. So the impact of this power alert starts reducing if you do it too often. The next thing that Eskom has at its disposal is a thing called load reduction. Now, load reduction is happening as we speak, and it's really a euphemism. It's what Eskom do to people and areas that have a poor record of paying for electricity. So in certain areas of South Africa, and sad to say, it's very often in the poorest of the poor areas, there are very high overloading of the distribution network because people don't pay for electricity. And they overload the distribution network, and it causes transformers to fail and fires to occur. And you've no doubt seen photographs of pole-top transformers catching fire, exploding. And when it happens, of course, it knocks out the whole neighborhood for many hours until Eskom, maybe even days, until Eskom find a new transformer and go and change it and fix it. And then, of course, it just happens again because people are overloading these transformers through illegal connections. So what Eskom do is they actually switch off these areas during peak periods, the morning peak and the evening peak. And it's there to protect their infrastructure. It also sends a signal to people that you're overloading the transformers through illegal connection. And it hopefully raises the awareness in the community not to do this overloading and not to have illegal connection. But it's happening all the time, and it reduces demand by about 400 megawatts, 200 megawatts at Eskom, 200 megawatts at municipalities. Then they have a thing called ripple control, and you've probably seen that now we have smart meters, and there's new techniques for managing geysers and reducing demand in domestic dwellings, and Eskom are piloting this. Now, look, ripple control and the control of hot water geysers is a technology about 50 years old, is very widely used overseas. But in South Africa, for one reason, we can't get our act together. And we used to have ripple control and control of hot water geysers, but it's kind of fallen into disuse through lack of maintenance, through municipalities that couldn't care less. And then, if you just leave it and you don't manage it and you don't maintain it and you don't fix it when it breaks, eventually the whole system fails. And that's where we are now. But now Eskom is starting to think about this, and this is a way of managing demand. You can control hot water geysers without negatively impacting the customer to any noticeable effect. And it can make a really big difference to managing the peak demand during the evening peak and the morning peak by heating up the water in the geyser during the off-peak periods in the middle of the night or in the middle of the day. And that in the evening when you want to take a bath, the water may be a little bit cooler, but it's not really noticeable. It saves a lot on peak demand. Okay, now that could save, up to 1,000 megawatts if it was implemented nationally, but it's not so easy. It's going to take time to install, etc. They're just piloting it now. When you're piloting, it's just a small sort of a pilot study, and hopefully it will turn into something big one day. But it is an opportunity, but it's not being very effectively done at the moment. Then, of course, power imports. In emergency conditions, when we are short of power, we can import power from our neighbors. Now, we already import a lot of power from our neighbors. We import about 1,500 megawatts from Mozambique. And, often people say to me, why are we exporting power to our neighbors while we're having load shedding in South Africa? And the answer is actually we import more power from our neighbors than we export. And our neighbors are helping us when we have electricity shortages. And when we don't have electricity shortage, we need to help our neighbors. It's a scratch each other's back situation. If we don't help our neighbors, they won't help us. And we get a lot of help from our neighbors. And there's talks now of importing power from extra power from Mozambique, Botswana and from Zambia. That's not a huge amount at the moment, but Mozambique is talking about an extra 1,000 megawatts, so it's not insignificant at all. Demand market participation is another lever. It's a lever. You pay certain customers who've got standby generators, you pay them to operate their standby generators when there's periods of high demand. You compensate them for the diesel that they're going to use. And it's, yes, there's a cost to demand market participation, but the cost can be lower than other methods. And certainly the cost of demand market participation is lower than the cost of load shedding to the economy. So demand market participation is a technique to manage demand by paying certain customers who've got large diesel standby generators to operate them during peak periods and compensate them for the diesel they use. Okay, then you have the thing called the interruptability contracts. This is the aluminium smelters at South 32, Mosul, and Hillside. Eskom can reduce demand by up to 2,000 megawatts by interrupting supply to these smelters. Now, in terms of their contract, their electricity contract with Eskom, Eskom is allowed to interrupt them without any penalty for a certain number of hours per week. And that's a very useful thing to Eskom. In return, these smelters get a very special price of electricity from Eskom. Some would argue too special, but be that as it may, in return for being able to interrupt them for a certain number of hours a week, they get a special price for electricity, and it's a valuable tool in Eskom's toolbox to reduce demand up to 2,000 megawatts when needed. And it doesn't cost Eskom anything. And it doesn't really cost the economy. It costs South 32 something, no doubt, in lost production. But they get a price of electricity special to compensate them. Okay, so those are all what I call the manual levers at Eskom's disposal. And they are very helpful, and they can reduce a significant. Oh, we didn't talk about load shedding after demand market participation. There is the load shedding that we currently experience, stage 1 to stage 8 in the current protocol, which can reduce demand by 1,000 to 8,000 megawatts. It's a manual process, and you can, if you added up all these, reduction techniques from power alerts down to interruptible contracts, you're talking about like, a lot of power. You're talking about 14,000 megawatts that you can reduce demand to bring supply and demand back into balance. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that when we're at stage 4 load shedding, as we are, let's say today, or stage 6 when we were a month ago, at stage 6, when we have stage 6 for extended periods of time, like we did have, what it means is that supply and demand has been brought back into balance by reducing demand by 6,000 megawatts. We're now in balance. Now that we're in balance, we can stay in balance forever. There's no risk of load shedding if we balance. The risk of load shedding comes when you are unable to reduce demand and bring supply and demand in balance. If you do nothing, you will have a national blackout. But if you pull the levers that Eskom has at its disposal to reduce demand, bring it into balance, there is no more risk of load shedding. So just because you're at stage 6 load shedding for a week doesn't mean to say that you're at enhanced risk of a national blackout, because you brought supply and demand back into balance. That's the point I wanted to get through. But then in addition to all these manual techniques, there's a whole lot of automatic techniques that can respond really quickly toward, if there is a situation where supply and demand are not in balance for a reason of faults on the system. When there's a fault on the system, the frequency of the power system starts to drop. The 50 hertz, normally if you're in balance, supply and demand in balance, the frequency is at 50 hertz. When demand is higher than supply, the frequency drops. It's like a generator. When you load it, you hear it go, starts slowing down. The frequency reduces. And they have what is known as automatic under-frequency load shedding. And we're at a certain frequency, a certain amount of load will be automatically kicked off the system. And they have all these different levels. And even when the frequency is dropping fast, in other words, the rate of change of frequency is fast, it responds even quicker, shedding load. So there's a whole lot of levels of automatic load shedding, which can, in the end, interrupt, a massive part of the South African demand. If that doesn't help and the frequency drops to 47.5 hertz, from 50 hertz down to 47.5, in other words, 2.5 hertz reduction, a turbine will start tripping out. And when that happens, that's what leads to a national blackout, because once a turbine trips out, there's less supply. Now supply starts dropping. And so the imbalance between supply and demand gets even bigger. And after the first turbine trips, the next one will trip out in a certain amount of time, and it gets into a cascading situation where all the turbines at the power station trip out, and you have what is called a national blackout. But the thing is, there's all these levers at our disposal. At the moment, we are pulling these up to the interruptible contracts on a manual basis regularly. There's a whole lot of other levers available. So we've pulled about half the levers necessary, but there's plenty more that can be pulled. This was just to show that it's the frequency of the system on the vertical axis that is the problem. When the frequency starts to drop, and this is a real curve of frequency versus time, and you can see how the frequency dropped from just above 50 hertz down to 49.65. The frequency dropped very rapidly. You know, this takes place within a second or two, 1 or 2 seconds. There is no time for load shedding when that happens. You now got to rely on automatic response. And this is a control system at Eskom that you can see. As the frequency drops fast, the automation steps in and it recovers the frequency. And it overshoots a little bit, and then it's an oscillation. So you can see how the automatic control system rapidly brought back the frequency back to 50 hertz. It then oscillates a little bit because it's what is known as an undamped control system. So there's a little bit of oscillation, but it managed to prevent the frequency from getting anywhere near 47.5 hertz. 47.5 hertz is the danger period. If you can respond quickly at 49.65 hertz, as it did in this case, you've avoided a national blackout. Okay. So what are the consequences of a national blackout? Well, they are really very severe. And I don't want to be alarmist, but just think about it. If you had no power for an extended period, let's just say for a week or two, in the whole of South Africa, you had no power, what would it look like? First of all, you have no lights, you have no refrigeration. Food is going to start going off. Phones, their batteries will run flat. The telecoms towers, they have got diesel generators and batteries in them. They'll start running flat or running out of diesel, so that the whole mobile network will go down. Credit card machines, batteries will go flat. So you won't be able to buy things on credit card. You won't, the ATMs have batteries in them, they will go flat. You won't be able to draw money. The standby generators that do exist around the country will start running out of diesel within a few days. So, you know, any sort of standby sort of facility you put will probably run out, including domestic and you know, batteries and homes and things like that. No telecoms, no radio, no TV. Petrol and diesel will run out. You won't be able to, because you can't operate the petrol pumps. You won't be able to fill up your car. Transportation will cease. Shops will close. No food, no drink, no water in the taps, because the reservoirs will run dry because you can't pump water up to the reservoirs. You know, when you don't have food, you don't have water, you don't have money, you don't have telecoms, you don't have phones and all of that, there's going to be social unrest and looting on a massive scale across the country that would make what happened in Durban and Gauteng look like a picnic. There'll be theft and vandalism of infrastructure, cables, lines, copper, steel, etc. In short, there'll be anarchy. That is the consequence. Now, it is a scary picture. It's a very scary picture. That's why you have to make a plan. Even in the remote possibility of this thing happening, even if it's a remote, you've got to have plans in place, even for remote possibilities. So you guys are in the risk business. You deal with risk all the time, and you insure risk and you cover risk. But I'm a simple guy, and I'm not in the insurance business. And I've sort of asked my question, what do we mean when we talk about risk? What is the risk of something happening? I kind of have a picture in my head that risk is made up of two factors. The one factor is the probability of an event occurring. And the other factor is the consequence of, and risk is a combination of these two factors, the probability of an event and the consequences. Now, you guys in the insurance business deal with the financial consequences of an event. It's reduced to money. So you may have an event which is a high probability event, but it has a low financial consequence. So even though it's a high probability, a low financial, it means the risk is not that high, because it's a risk you can bear, you can manage that risk, you can insure that risk. You can also have a situation where the probability of an event is very low, but the consequences of that event are enormous. Like, for example, a nuclear accident in a power plant. The probability of happening is very, very low. They've taken extreme measures to avoid it, but the consequence of the event is so serious that no insurance company in the world, not even groups of insurance companies, reinsurance companies, you cannot insure the consequences of a nuclear disaster, and it's left to the governments and ultimately the people of that country to bear the risk and to bear the financial consequences through our taxes. We're ultimately self-insuring that risk because it's too much of a risk for an insurance company to take. And some of the thing applies to a national blackout. The probability of a national blackout is very low for the reasons that I've explained. All the levers that were put in place, the plans, that's the extensive emergency plans, the probability is very low, but the consequences of that event are so high, these consequences that you can see on the slide, that some insurance companies, the major insurance companies, are deciding that they cannot cover this in their policies, and they are removing it from their cover. Okay. Now, a lot of companies now are starting to get a bit worried, about this national blackout. We all know that's a low probability event, but you do need to plan for low. I mean, Eskom planned for it. They've got detailed plans in place. The banking industry got a bit worried, and the Banking Association of South Africa have done a study on behalf of all their members. They've got plans, how to extend their banking system services. In the case of, do they need bigger tanks for their diesel, more storage on site, batteries, whatever? I don't know, all the techniques that they can bring to bear to try and at least manage the risk. I'm not saying you can completely eliminate all the consequences, but the longer you can get by without grid power, the better you're going to be. So you've got to start thinking. Every company needs to start thinking about their power system and what would they do. And you need to, I believe you do need to put in place plans. If it depends, every business is different. You have to look at your business, look at the consequences, and decide, what can I do, or what can my business do? And I think businesses, far-sighted businesses, are starting to think about these things. But I don't want to be alarmist. That is not to say that it's a high probability event. It's not a high probability event. It's a high consequence event. But the combination of the two make it a risk event that some insurance companies don't want to insure. Okay. Then the question people often ask is, how do we recover from a national blackout? Now, Eskom have got these plans in place, and I just want to make a few points here, and that is that South Africa has got a lot of things in its favor about how to recover from a national blackout, but there's also South Africa's got some complicating factors that other countries don't have. But from a point of view of the factors that mitigate a quicker recovery, we have these multiple technical defenses that I've described. We also have what is known as the islanding mode for new generations. So some of the new generating power stations at Eskom have what they call an islanding mode. Now, these are coal-fired power stations. And instead of shutting down the power station completely, what they do is they go and they operate the power stations in islanding mode at a very low load, with a very low, but the boilers are still operating. The boilers are still taking in some coal and operating. The thing about a coal-fired power station is, if you switch it off, it starts to cool down, and it takes a long time to restart it. It can take some days to restart from scratch. From a cold power station to recover to full output can take several days. However, if you can keep the power station and the boilers sort of ticking over, the recovery can be within an hour or two. So that is a useful thing to have what is called islanding mode on some of the power stations. Not all the power stations, the older power stations, they can't do this, but on the new ones, they design this islanding mode as part of its operation modes. And that's very helpful when the whole country is in a blackout. You need certain power stations to be able to restart quickly so that you can restart the whole power system from scratch. And so that's very helpful. Eskom do regular testing of these black start generators. They have a certain number of black start generators, 3 or 4, and they test them regularly. And one of the black start generators is the pump storage schemes. So you have this water at the top dam, the water in the bottom dam, and they never allow the top dam to run empty. Never. They must, let's say 20%, they keep 20% of the water just in case they need that for a black start. So a black start can use that hydropower to restart that plant quickly, like within an hour, easily, even quicker, if a pump storage scheme, if you've got water in the top dam. Okay, so that's something useful. They test this, and they also simulate, and they practice, and they train the system operator staff how to recover in the case of emergency, and how to respond in an emergency, even if you have a sudden drop in frequency and you need to respond really quickly. Okay, there's automatic systems, but there's also, you've got to do the right thing in the right way. And it's like a flight simulator. You've got to practice. And that's why they have these simulators. So the national controls at Eskom is considered to be a center of excellence at Eskom, strong leadership, and very important, independent leadership that is not subject to political interference. Political interference would really increase the risk of a national blackout. When politicians start telling these people what to do, instead of them doing what they know they have to do, for political reasons, that is what can cause big problems. Okay, the complicating factors, of course, is that we have these high levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, and social instability, poor service delivery. We do experience social unrest, violence, vandalism, theft, looting. It's happened. We've seen it before. And it happens even more when there's labor unrest at Eskom, which is not completely unusual. Usually once a year during the labor negotiations, there could be some labor unrest. There is this political and economic warfare and sabotage. We've heard about it. We hope it's under control. And, a blackout occurring in conjunction with, let's just say, for example, an Eskom labor strike would really complicate the matter and take longer. So people often ask, how long does it take to recover from a national blackout? And it's a difficult question to answer. I mean, how long is a piece of string? So the people I consulted explained to me these 3 different scenarios. So they look at an optimistic scenario, a realistic scenario, and a pessimistic scenario. I'm not going to go into all of this in detail. You've got this slide. But the optimistic scenario would mean that the first power stations could start recovering in 2 hours. Those are these islanding mode power stations and the pumped water scheme. They could be up within 2 hours, but the full recovery of the whole power system back to normal would take a week. That's optimistic. Realistic, the first up power plants would be in 2 hours, and the last up will be in 2 weeks. So the system will get restored in 2 weeks, realistically. That assumes certain, that nothing goes 100% to plan in an emergency, and it takes that into account. The optimistic scenario assumes that everything works, all the plans work, no failures of the system, and that there's no unrest. Scenario 2 assumes that there is some unrest, but that the electrical infrastructure remains intact. The third scenario is the pessimistic scenario, which would be an extended blackout, which would last up to 4 weeks. And I must stress this is a pessimistic scenario. It assumes that there are a number of failures, that there's also things like civil unrest, like a labor strike, complicating things, that there are islanding failures, that the islanding systems didn't work properly, and that there's a significant amount of line and cable and switchgear and transformer and electrical infrastructure theft and vandalism, which slows down the recovery process. In other words, if you've had transformer theft and failures and damage, fires, goodness knows what, caused by unrest, it's going to take significantly longer to recover from a national blackout. So bottom line, you can see there, full recovery would last between a week to 4 weeks, depending on the scenario that you're considering. So it's quite significant, but the probability is very, very low. Yeah, this is my concluding slide, and that is to say that emergency reserves are now being used in a way that they should not be used. That's not a good thing. So, for example, we're using the diesel open cycle gas turbines, which were intended to be peaking plants and emergency plants. They were intended to operate for about an hour a day maximum as peaking plant, and they were supposed to be there on standby for emergency conditions. They're being used at the moment to meet demand. In other words, they're being used for operational needs instead of emergency needs and peaking needs. That's not good. And therefore, you sometimes run out of diesel, and it means increased maintenance and all of that. So we're using some of our emergency reserve for operational purposes. Not good. Load shedding, I also want to make the point that load shedding should not be accepted. It should not become the new normal for South Africa. There are probably about 5 countries in the world, a handful of countries, 5 countries in the world, that are experiencing load shedding for 6 or more hours a day. And there is no reason whatsoever why South Africa should be one of them. Most of these countries that experience that are basket cases, war situations, disaster situations. In fact, there's probably less than 5 that experience like stage 6 load shedding every day for 3 months, which is what we had. So we should not accept it. This is not the normal. It should never become the normal. We are not, and we don't want to be, in the situation of Nigeria or Zimbabwe. There's no reason why we should. We've got very significant natural energy resources: coal, water, wind, solar, hydro, all of these things we've got. We should not be in this position. The problem actually is not an energy problem. It's not that we don't have the energy. It's a political and a management problem. We're not managing the situation properly. We're not planning properly. We don't have the right policies in place, and we're not executing on our plans properly. So we should have this, and we do now have a national priority project to end load shedding. And this should be the undivided attention of government and all public and private stakeholders. It's not just a government problem. If we wait for government, we're going to wait a long time. We all need to start taking ownership of this problem and become part of the solution. And we're beginning to see it now. And there is light at the end of the tunnel. And there is this need for a strong independent system operator. And we've got it. We've got a strong independent. We must just make sure it stays strong and independent and is not subject to political interference. And the point I made earlier, and I want to make it again, is that load shedding level, the stage 6 load shedding level for 3 months, doesn't mean we're having an increased probability of a national blackout, because we brought supply and demand back into balance by doing that load shed, and therefore the risk returns to 0. The other thing I want to make is that the level of load shedding does not indicate the level of risk of a national blackout. It's the system frequency. The 50 hertz, and the rate of, if the frequency is not at 50 hertz, or the frequency is dropping at a high rate, that is the indicator of a high risk. Unfortunately, you and I don't have a frequency meter sitting on our desk to monitor this risk all the time. But at Eskom National Control, they do have this. And it's automated, and they're monitoring the system frequency, very accurately all the time, responding to changes in frequency and responding to changes in the rate of change of frequency. That is what manages the avoiding the national blackout. So it's the system frequency that is the primary metric as to the risk of a national blackout. And then lastly, just to point out again that there are well-established and well-practiced protocols in place with multiple defenses to mitigate risk. And we've got all these levers at disposal. Eskom has these levers at disposal. That is its job. At Eskom National Control, their job is to manage supply and demand and avoid a national blackout. And they're doing it. They're well trained. It's a center of excellence. So I think the probability of a national blackout still remains very low indeed. Thank you. That ends I'm going to stop sharing now. Stop share. And I'm available if there are any questions arising. I will ask the I2 people to please just answer the questions if there are any that you want me to handle.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. It was very informative, my word. We do have a few questions. I'm just wary of the time. If you do need to log off, I have shared the presentation on the chat, and we will upload the video for you to watch later. But maybe, Chris, if you can stay on for maybe another 5 minutes, we have a few questions.
Certainly.
Okay, perfect.
Sure.
So I'll start with Laura's question. Laura says currently there are a lot of incidents where they are struggling to bring back power after load shedding. Does that indicate an increase in chances of blackouts?
No, I don't think so, really. The problem there is tied up with the fact that in certain areas, let's say in Johannesburg and in other towns, the transformer supplying your neighborhood might be running fairly close to its limit, and under normal circumstances. Then you have a sudden loss of power, so the loading of that transformer drops dramatically. A lot of the geysers over this 2-hour, 4-hour period start to cool down. And then suddenly, 4 hours later, power comes back on again. Now, when power comes back again, thousands of geysers in the neighborhood are all switching on to start heating up the water again. Whereas under normal circumstances, these geysers are all sort of randomly switching on and off because the temperature is stable and some are cooling down, some are heating up, depending on the water usage. But when you switch on all the geysers simultaneously and they all come on heating up the water, that transformer was quite highly loaded under normal. Now suddenly it's being overloaded. When you switch back on power, that transformer is overloaded and then it trips out after a minute, let's just say. And now you've got to wait for the guy from the municipality to come and switch it back on again. That could be an hour, who knows? It could be a day. Depends on where you live. But I don't think, these are quite localized issues, and I don't think that's going to make it dramatic. It's actually going to help things from national blackout because it's tripped out your neighborhood. So instead of having 3 hours of load shedding, you've got 4. So it's actually reducing the chances of a national blackout, actually, if I think about it now.
And then one last question, Chris, from Dale. Dale is asking, in the medium term, what do you think will happen to Eskom's income as people and businesses that can afford to will go to solar and wind route, whilst those that can't afford alternative energy also can't afford increased electricity tariffs?
Yeah, okay. So this is an argument that Eskom often put the fear of the Lord into us, that if we start looking after ourselves, they're going to go under and things are going to be worse. But I don't buy the argument, and I want to explain why. You've got to understand, Eskom at the moment cannot meet demand. Eskom is already today losing revenue because it cannot meet demand. So by us putting in solar PV and battery storage actually is not subtracting from Eskom's revenue, is meeting some of the revenue that it's already losing. And we're actually helping Eskom. We're actually helping Eskom by putting in solar PV and rooftop. So it doesn't have as much load shedding, but it doesn't change Eskom's revenue. Eskom's revenue is already going down because it can't meet demand. It is switching people off. It's not earning revenue from those customers. And if we can help ourselves without harming Eskom, that's a good thing. Of course, it is a bit different if Eskom is already meeting demand. If Eskom is already meeting demand and you start putting in solar PV, then you are reducing Eskom's demand. But by putting it in at the moment, you're not reducing Eskom's demand. You're just reducing load shedding. But I think ultimately these things all sort itself. Why are we putting in rooftop solar PV and battery storage? We're putting it in because Eskom can't meet demand. If Eskom was meeting demand, maybe we wouldn't put it in. The other thing I want to say is really it's not our business to protect industries that are failing. These industries that are failing need to start changing their own business model and looking carefully at their own business and processes to ensure that they can do the job that they're supposed to do. And if they can't, they mustn't expect other people to hold back from doing the job that they are supposed to do. So I don't buy the argument. I think, A, we're helping Eskom by putting in solar PV and rooftop. We're reducing the national, we're helping the South African economy. And we're reducing the amount of load shedding that the whole country. There's another argument that's often made. People who are putting in solar PV are generally the more wealthy and well-to-do parts of the population, and it's unfair on the poorer population. No, but people like mines and industry and domestic and commercial putting in solar PV rooftop, we're actually helping reducing load shedding through the whole country. Even the people who are not putting in solar PV are going to experience less load shedding. Right now, today, we're having lower levels of load shedding because there are higher levels of rooftop and solar PV and wind and solar being installed around the country. It's helping South Africa, but we're still not in a situation where Eskom can meet demand because they're going down even faster. Their performance, you've seen the graphs of that trend, that downward trend of the availability. That's what Eskom's plant is doing. It's going down. And we are helping them by supplementing our own energy needs. That's my answer to that question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. And I think you may have already answered Mohammed's question in that as well. So Mohammed asked that large frequency drop that happened last year, does anybody know why?
Yeah, a large frequency drop generally occurs when there is a major fault, like on the transmission grid. If, for example, let's say you've got two power lines feeding a massive amount of power down to the Southern Cape. If those two power lines trip out, causing a loss of supply or disconnecting a significant load, there will be a major disturbance in the frequency, and it happens like quickly within a second. And that's the hardest thing to mitigate. If there's a slow increase of demand above supply, you can respond to that with load shedding because it's a manual process. It's a normal, what I call a production. You have a daily increase in demand, between day and night, and et cetera, and hot weather and cold weather. And you can respond to that in a manual process easily. But when you have a sudden disturbance on the national grid caused by a major fault, a short circuit on the system, which suddenly causes the frequency to drop, that's when you've got to respond in a second, even less than a second, in order to bring the frequency back up again. That's when you rely on these automatic systems. So I just want to make the point that the normal supply and demand variations due to the daily cycle of load is handled in a certain way, but the major disturbances on the national grid, which are caused by fault conditions, sudden, instantaneous fault conditions, that requires a much faster response time, and that's handled by these other levers. But that drop in frequency was not caused by a normal mismatch of supply and demand due to the daily demand cycle. That was caused by a fault on the power system, on the network, on the transmission grid.
Cool. Just a reminder to everybody, we're going to wrap up in the next minute or so. I just want to take Wendy's question because she's still on the call. If you do need to drop off, thank you very much for joining us. So Wendy's asking, what was the thought process behind the punitive measures against ordinary citizens who want to go off-grid or partially by installing solar to lighten the load on the system at their own cost? But there's a serious talk about taxing them. Why is this?
Yeah, it is an unfortunate reality that some people at Eskom in the past and some municipalities regard solar PV and battery storage, and people, putting in plans to help Eskom and the municipality. They see this as a threat to their business model. Now, I've tried to explain to you why they should not see it as a threat to their business model. And unfortunately, ideologically, some people come at this from a certain angle, and they don't want to see the facts of the matter. And The facts of the matter are, and the far-sighted people at Eskom and municipality are understanding this. If you look at what is happening in Cape Town, if you look at what's happened, it was recently announced in Joburg, they're starting to incentivize people to install rooftop solar PV and battery storage because it helps the municipality. It's bad for a municipality to have all their industries and commerce and shops, have no power. It's bad for the economy, and when it's bad for the local economy, it's bad for the municipality. They lose revenue because the local economy is suffering. And the far-sighted municipalities are beginning to realize that, first of all, customers must be seen as part of the solution and not a problem. When customers are seen as a problem, that business got a problem, because it means it's treating its customers like they are the problem. No, the problem is not the customers. The problem is the supply of electricity, and that's what's got to be sorted out. And we cannot solve the problem by looking after the people that are failing to do what they are supposed to do. We just cannot do that. So I believe you're right, that there are punitive measures out there, but it's starting to change now. There is a new awakening, that you need to look after the customer and not treat him like the enemy. Thanks.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, Chris. We thank you and appreciate all of the knowledge that you have imparted on us today. Thank you to everybody that's attended the session. We had about 300 people on the Teams call, so very well attended session and very informative, as it touches on our businesses, it touches on our lives, it impacts each and every one of us differently. So thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for all the questions. Thank you for the interaction, guys, and we will see you next week for another session of iTOOsday. Thank you.
Thanks and bye.
Thanks, bye.